I think that many of my Venezuelan friends and close friends would tell President Trump, if they got a chance to speak to him, they would say, please invade. Please get rid of Maduro.
Early Saturday morning, U.S. forces launched a military strike on Venezuela, capturing President Nicolás Maduro and his wife and flying them to New York to face federal narco-terrorism charges. This episode of Global Insights was recorded before those events, but the conversation that follows helps explain how we got here.
More than 80 countries live in dictatorship. So what's the U.S. supposed to do? You can't go to war to remove all of them. Violent regime change is much more likely to usher in another dictatorship.
Venezuela was once the wealthiest country in Latin America. Between 2012 and 2020, it experienced the largest peacetime economic collapse ever documented, a 71% decline per capita GDP. Roughly a quarter of the population has fled. Hyperinflation persisted for years. And as Maduro's government became increasingly authoritarian, the United States responded with sweeping economic sanctions, framing drug trafficking and mass migration as national security threats. How did Venezuela reach this point? What role did U.S. policy play in the crisis? And was there ever a path towards stability that didn't end in confrontation?
So what I would say to Trump is use your leverage. I mean, you have the leverage. I don't necessarily like how you obtained it, but use your leverage to force a negotiation here.
Today on Global Insights, the roots of the U.S.-Venezuela standoff. Today, we're joined by Francisco Rodriguez, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and Faculty Affiliate at the University of Denver's Korbel School of International Studies. He is the founder of Oil for Venezuela and author of The Collapse of Venezuela, Scorched Earth Politics and Economic Decline. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
I usually like to start with some context setting, but in this case, I want to start with the context setting about you, because you've had a lot of experience working within the government of Venezuela. I think you, if I recall correctly, you know some of the players that we're often reading about in the news. And so I'd love for you to just talk a little bit from your vantage point about your background within Venezuela, within the government, and sort of what drove you to write the book that you did, the one that came out about the collapse.
Sure. Well, hi, Courtney. Thanks very much for the introduction. Hi to everybody. I'm delighted to have this conversation on Venezuela. And well, let me start out by saying that I'm Venezuelan. I grew up in Venezuela during the 1970s. Venezuela was actually the richest country in Latin America. Now, when I was growing up, I also, and particularly in my teenage years, I lived through the economy entering a very large and unprecedented crisis. Partly because of that, I just thought that studying economics was very important. I thought that you needed to understand the economy to make a difference in people's lives. And I got an undergrad in economics at Universidad Católica. I earned my PhD at Harvard in 1998. Then I became an assistant professor at the University of Maryland at College Park. And then a couple of years later, I get a call from the president of the National Assembly of Venezuela, offered me to be the chief economist of the Venezuelan Congressional Budget Office. I was head of the Venezuelan Congressional Budget Office. I was seen by both Chavismo and the opposition as being a consensus candidate. I was appointed by unanimity. When I got there, I started getting into trouble with the government party because Chavez's party felt we're still the majority, so you answer to us. I was like, well, I do my job. My job was essentially to inform them. I led a team of economists that would inform them on the economic and financial implications of proposed legislation. So that meant that I managed to stay in the position for several more years. And I, during that early experience, it allowed me to meet and interact with many of Venezuela's current political leaders and to observe firsthand some of the main protagonists in the country's political evolution and descent into crisis, including that legislator who unsuccessfully tried to have me fired. His name was Nicolás Maduro. Now, after I left the Congressional Budget Office, I returned to academia. I spent time in international organizations, as you noted, Courtney, the UN Human Development Report. Then I went to the private sector. I spent some time at Bank of America. And then I decided to return fully to academia and research. Among other things, I decided to write a book about Venezuela, just to try to make sense of it. Basically, what I've tried to do over time is to find ways to think about my country's economic crisis, to understand why this country has suffered this collapse, and to understand, use my knowledge as an economist, a social scientist, to understand how we can get out of it.
All right. Thank you. That is a great introduction, your role, and then I think some of the ups and downs. I'd love to do a little bit more context setting right now and just talk about the U.S.-Venezuela relationship. Could you just walk us through what you think some of the key drivers are in the U.S., in the relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela, particularly both in the political realm and the economic realm as well? We're basically an American audience here. So what do you think is important for Americans to understand this bilateral relationship?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we start out talking about what actually happened in Venezuela, because the way that I see Venezuela, it is a domestic crisis that became international. First of all, just the magnitudes. Venezuela suffered the largest economic collapse ever seen outside of wartime. Between 2012 and 2020, Venezuela's per capita GDP fell by 71.5%. It's roughly a fourth of the population has left the country. Poverty rates have risen to over 90%. The country suffered hyperinflation for several years. It was actually one of the longest hyperinflations in world history. A large level of oil dependence. Venezuela's oil revenues disappear. If somehow oil becomes worthless, then Venezuela goes back into the Stone Age. It's like this economy cannot live without selling its oil. This is what it produces and it sells to the rest of the world, and it has a lot of it, but that's what drives its economy. And basically what happened was exactly that. What happened was that oil revenues collapsed by 93%. That's the main driver of this collapse in income of 71.5%. Now, of course, that only shifts the question back further. Well, why was it that oil revenues collapsed? And we can talk about that. But first of all, to understand the dynamics of what happened, the first thing that happened was that oil prices started declining. So Venezuela had been a democratic political system and imperfect democracy during those roughly the second half of the 20th century. Then in the 1990s, a political outsider, Hugo Chávez, rose to power. And he pushed forward this program of radical transformation, also highly personalistic, concentrating a lot of power in the presidency. And he also benefited from this huge oil boom. When he was elected, Venezuela's oil was selling at $9 a barrel. When he died 13 years later, Venezuelan oil was selling for more than $100 a barrel. Then he dies, he leaves power to his successor, Nicolás Maduro. Oil prices start falling from $100 to around $30 between 2012 and 2016. Venezuela's economy goes into a deep recession. Maduro starts cutting imports, cutting social spending. And then something else happens, which is that, of course, if the country, and the country was going into crisis essentially to a great extent because Chavez had mismanaged the economy so much that he hadn't saved any of this wealth. If you didn't save any of that and you started living the lifestyle of a country that derives income from $100 a barrel, then you're going to suffer a huge crisis. So Venezuela's economy went into a tailspin. Maduro completely mismanaged that whole process of adjustment and made the crisis a lot deeper. But he also started becoming unpopular, and then he started becoming increasingly authoritarian. And because he knew that he would lose elections if he didn't repress. And once he started repressing, that's a moment where the opposition starts looking for ways in which they can contest this rule. One of the ways which they found to do it was by trying to cut off Venezuela's access to international markets, to international oil markets, to international financial markets. And it got together with the fact that at that moment, 2017, which was like this change of strategy of the opposition, but also when Maduro had become increasingly authoritarian, Donald Trump was coming into office in the US. And Donald Trump was very willing to hear any alternatives that would allow him to put pressure on Maduro, to drive Maduro from power. In fact, it's in mid-2017 that Donald Trump is actually the first one who talks about a military option for Venezuela. And at that moment, his whole cabinet was surprised. They were like, we haven't discussed military option. Nobody had put this on the table. And it just it occurred to Donald Trump, well, if we're going to do something, I mean, we could use the military. He didn't end up using the military then, but he did impose very draconian economic sanctions on Venezuela, on Venezuela's access to financial markets, on Venezuela's access to oil markets. And a lot of my research, which is captured in several chapters of my book, traces the impact of those sanctions on the country's economy. The short story there is they contributed significantly. They're not the only cause of the collapse. As I said, this country had been mismanaged by Chavez and mismanaged by Maduro. So they definitely are to blame quite a lot, but sanctions are too. In fact, when I look at that 71% decline between 2012 and 2020, roughly half of it is explained as a result of U.S. economic sanctions. And that's where I start kind of laying out this story of, well, okay, so if you want to understand what happened to Venezuela, you really have to understand its political conflict. And you really have to understand that the two sides that were involved in this political conflict at one moment decided that part of their strategy for trying to impose themselves in that battle, Maduro to stay in power, the opposition to drive him from power, was to weaponize the economy. And they all felt very justified at doing this. And they felt, well, it's what we have to do to win. And it became an increasingly, in the ends justifies the means logic. But the result and my point and my research, and I as an economist, I didn't undertake this research project in order to pass moral judgment on the actors nor to blame anybody, I mean, from a moral standpoint, because I think that's a deeply different conversation. There are people on the opposition who have told me, yes, we recognize that the sanctions harmed the Venezuelan economy, but Maduro has the solution. I mean, he shouldn't have stolen the elections. He shouldn't have behaved undemocratically, and therefore it's his fault. And I'm not going to tell you that I necessarily agree with that argument, but it's an argument that I understand. And in fact, sometimes, and this is something that scares me, and which I develop in the next to last chapter of my book, actually, where I look at what we can learn from Venezuela for other cases in the world. And I talk about the U.S., and sometimes I hear some of those same elements in U.S. political thought. The idea that whatever it takes to prevail politically, even if that requires doing things which are going to make life more difficult for people in the country.
That is fascinating, and I hope we can get to that in the discussion. I wanted to ask just a couple more questions before we open it up to questions from the audience. I think one thing I'd like to just hear about is you mentioned that this was a domestic conflict that became international. Kind of a two-part question. One, with the U.S. piece and Donald Trump in particular, during his first presidency, was it, and apologies if you mentioned this, was it the immigration that was driving him to want to have a military option to get Maduro from power, or is there something else that is in this relationship that I'm missing? And then the next question is who are some of the other international actors that we might want to be aware of within the domestic situation?
Well, no, it wasn't immigration in the first administration, at least not in the way in which it is now. Because Venezuela's migrant crisis, it had started. You start seeing an outsurge of Venezuelan migrants, essentially as the economy starts collapsing around 2016. But they were mostly going to other Latin American countries. The upsurge into the U.S. actually comes much later. It comes around 2020, 2021. I can talk about the reasons for that in a minute. So now there was some emigration, not quantitatively very large, but of somewhat of a different nature. And this was emigration that had come out during the Chavez years, even during those years in which the economy was doing well, but that was primarily kind of elites, economic elites, or just people with a lot of human capital. And by the way, I kind of include myself in those because when I went back to Venezuela in 2000, the even after I left the National Assembly in 2004, I actually stayed for a brief time teaching at a business school in Venezuela called IESA, where my wife was also a professor, and we would have liked to stay there. I mean, there's really, I mean, those of you, some of you can know Venezuela and just have been there and have already mentioned how much fun it is to be there. So, I mean, for me, like being an academic, being in a university, being able to teach and do research, and being able to do it in Venezuela, it's a dream. It was a dream, but it just wasn't economically viable. Even though the Venezuelan economy was not doing poorly, there were some sectors like academia where life was not easy, at least compared to the opportunities that you would have in U.S. academia. So, but then part of what happened is that some of this emigration went to, a lot of it, perhaps for, I don't know, if for historical reasons, for a certain level of affinity, or maybe just because the climate was better, went to Florida. And in Florida, there was also a very important Cuban population, a Cuban exile population. And part of what happened is that this Venezuelan population, together with the Cuban population and with some very important, say very prominent Venezuelan opposition politicians, business persons who had been opposed to Chavez, some of them which went into either explicit or self-imposed exile, they started becoming a very important political advocacy group. So they started driving Florida politics. So that by the time that Trump gets into office in 2017, you don't yet have this upsurge of Venezuelan migration of low-skilled migrants who are trying to cross the border, but you do have this Cuban Venezuelan community, and perhaps the politician who has most successfully catered to this community and represented what this community wants is our current Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who was also very influential in the first Trump administration. Some people called him the shadow Secretary of State at that time. And he very much pushed President Trump towards this idea of maximum pressure, which today we're seeing another iteration of it. But it was basically the idea of, look, you just have to put pressure on Maduro, on the Venezuelan economy. If you do that, it's going to break. The military is going to turn on him, and you're going to get regime change in Venezuela. About the other actors, yes, there's the first Trump administration. At that moment, the two other important political actors were, well, in Colombia, you had Juan Manuel Santos, who was a moderate. Then you had Ivan Duque, who was more from the right. And then you had President Bolsonaro in Brazil. You also had, there was a period, now we're seeing another right turn in Latin America, but in the 2017 period, you actually had a bit of a right turn. So you had like this wave where there's something that's called the pink tide, which kind of Chavez epitomized, and there was Evo Morales, Ortega, Lula. So there was a moment in which Latin America was dominated by left-wing presidents. Then you had this conservative resurgence in the mid-2010s. That's the moment at which Trump unleashes this maximum pressure campaign on Maduro, particularly after 2019, when Trump recognized his opposition legislator Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. So there you also had the Venezuelan opposition also had all of these allies in the region, where the region was mostly mostly had governments that were in the right or center right. They formed a very powerful coalition against Maduro to try to put pressure on Maduro. There's a chapter in my book which I called Politicians Without Borders, which tells this story of how essentially both sides start internationalizing the conflict. And then, of course, Maduro goes, well, where he needs to go. I mean, he has his allies. His allies are China, are Russia, Iran. And Iran may sound like a marginal country, but when But when the US was trying to isolate Venezuela economically, Iran is one of the countries with an oil industry that has lived with sanctions since 1979, could teach Venezuela how to circumvent sanctions. And in fact, many people in the Venezuelan oil industry learned how to have their tankers turn off their transponders from the Iranians. Then there's another set of factors in the region. Of course, there's Cuba, with which there's this historical solidarity with the Venezuelan government. There's Nicaragua, similarly. But then there are also the center-left governments in the region, which now are very important. So, you have Gustavo Petro in Colombia, you have Lula again in Brazil. This really complicates, let me put it this way. I think that if we had a conservative government in Colombia right now, the U.S. would be asking that government to let it put U.S. troops in Colombian territory as part of the military campaign against Venezuela. But the U.S. can't do that, not because, some people characterize Petro as a friend to Maduro. I think that this relationship is a lot more complicated. But definitely he's not a friend to Donald Trump, and he's not going to be an ally of any type of military operation.
Thank you. This is fascinating. I'd love to try to get in one more quick question just so that we can kind of take it to the current moment and looking ahead. I know it might not be easy, but if you could just talk a little bit, I know you wrote an article for the FT about what you think the Trump administration should do differently if its goal is long-term stability in Venezuela. Though after this conversation, I'm kind of getting the sense that is not necessarily the goal. So right. I'd love to, if you could just walk us through where you think an off-ramp could be potentially.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start answering that actually by telling you what I think that many of my Venezuelan friends and close friends actually would tell President Trump. They would, if they got a chance to speak to him, they would say, please invade. Please get rid of Maduro. They would say, we want to be Panama. We want to be Panama today, not Panama under Noriega. Maduro is a brutal dictator, and we tried everything. We tried to drive him out through elections, and now we need your help. And in fact, we have a very important political figure, Venezuela's Nobel Prize laureate, Maria Corina Machado, who is saying exactly this. And Machado, I've known Machado also for years and have seen her political evolution, and it's quite a remarkable one. And she's definitely a very brave person, immensely courageous, with a charisma that is there, yet qualitatively different in a very relevant sense. Political scientist Javier Corrales at Amherst made this, I think, remarkably important point, which is that she is the only female political leader in Latin America that has emerged on her own political career, on her own merits, not as a shadow to another politician. So she is not Cristina Kirchner, who was the wife of a former president of Argentina. She's not Dilma Rousseff, who came to power as being a close ally of Lula da Silva. She built her political movement from scratch. And I think, I was listening to a very famous speech that is stayed in the mind of a lot of Venezuelans, where Maria Corina Machado was a first-term legislator, 2012, and Chavez actually gave a 9-hour speech before the National Assembly. And at hour 7, Maria Corina essentially kind of interrupts him, and she says, the reality that you're telling us is not there. I know another reality. I know a reality of women who cannot get milk for their children, and of small businessmen who have been expropriated by your administration. So it was really a remarkably compelling moment. But at the same time, and I think that we have to understand Machado carefully, because at the same time, she says to Chavez, there is a decent Venezuela that does not agree with your project. Your project is a project of expropriations. Your project is a project of stealing. The decent Venezuela does not want that. So Maria Corina Machado, her political career has been based on building this narrative where there's this contrast between the decent Venezuela, the good Venezuelans, and the evil Venezuela. And that's the way that she characterized Chavez, and that's the way that she characterized Luis Maduro. She's right. I mean, Maduro is a very bad guy. Maduro is an evil dictator. But Chavez and even Maduro has gotten millions of Venezuelan votes. And Chavez, during many years, won Venezuelan elections with more than 2/3 of the vote. Chavez was immensely popular, and maybe it was that oil wealth, but still to this day, actually, the most popular politician in Venezuela is not Maria Corina Machado. She's second. The most popular politician in Venezuela is Hugo Chávez. He's not alive. Okay, maybe that's not fair, but he's still, people remember him very kindly. So part of what happens is that, and to return to your question of what I would say to the President of the United States is, look, the Venezuelan reality is much more complicated than a battle of good versus evil. Not because there aren't good people and because there aren't bad people, but because these leaders lead political movements in which millions of Venezuelans see themselves represented, both the opposition and Chavismo. And the moment in which you characterize a whole political movement, much more a political movement in which millions of Venezuelans and a great majority saw themselves represented, saw their aspirations for change captured, the moment at which you characterize that as being evil, the moment at which you erroneously, wrongly talk about Venezuela as having lived in dictatorship during the last quarter century, which is false, because Hugo Chavez, who did a lot of wrong things, but he repeatedly won elections. And even Nicolás Maduro won elections up until 2013. So what you have is a different problem here. And it's not a problem that you're going to solve by invading. Now, the other thing that I would say to the president is, look, I mean, don't listen to me. I'm a Venezuelan. Of course, I'm interested in the well-being of Venezuelans. But if I put on, if I put myself in the shoes of a U.S. policymaker, I mean, I would very much, as a Venezuelan, I want democracy to come to Venezuela. As an American, I have to tell you, and it's not a pretty truth, but it is the truth. More than 80 countries live in dictatorship nowadays. 75% of the world's population lives under them. So what's the U.S. supposed to do? There are people who are oppressed by these dictators in all of these countries, and all of them want to talk to the President of the United States. So what are you going to do? You can't go to war to remove Maduro, Putin, Lukashenko, Mohammed bin Salman, Xi Jinping, Sisi, all of them? Well, obviously not. There's the U.S. We may value democracy, but still understand that we have to live in a world in which a large part of that world is not democratic. So then you actually have to try to tackle a question, both of what U.S. national policy interests are here and how is it that you promote them. And also, if you want to promote democracy, you want to think about what's the best way to do this. And the evidence actually overwhelmingly tells you that invading a country is not the way to do it. First of all, violent regime change, whether it be invasions, coups, civil wars, is much more likely to, when it puts an end to a dictatorship, actually usher in another dictatorship. And part of the problem is that dictatorships build states where power is very concentrated. So when the opposition comes into control of these states, the temptation to use that power to pursue their ends. Sometimes I try to have conversations with people in the Venezuelan opposition and tell them, look, yes, democracy is about separation of powers. That's why the opposition won the presidency And that means that you want control of the executive branch. What that means is that if you respect the Venezuelan constitution, you should govern coexisting with the judiciary. They tell me, what? The Chavista judiciary? Are you crazy? Are you out of your mind? The first thing that we have to do is get rid of these people. So, but when the project becomes capturing the state and creating a state without separation of powers, without checks and balances, you can very easily evolve towards another authoritarian state. And yes, I fully agree that what is morally correct is for Nicolás Maduro, for Diosdado Cabello, and for all of their cronies to be held accountable for their crimes. But how do we stop that process from becoming a process in which thousands or tens of thousands of local Chavista leaders end up being persecuted also and being thrown in jail? Who stops the new leaders from doing that? Are we going to trust in their self-restraint? Well, here's the point. It's the way in which stable democracies get built is not pretty. It's through negotiation. And it's through negotiation between people who very much dislike each other. In fact, it's through negotiations with people that are not nice people because they've been dictators. That's the way in which, that's why there's a lot of evidence also that when you transition from dictatorship you transition out of a dictatorship through negotiation, that's much more likely to end in a stable democracy. So what I would say to Trump is use your leverage. I mean, you have the leverage. I don't necessarily like how you obtained it, but use your leverage to force a negotiation here. I mean, don't try to, we can go again. And by the way, we're now in this really weird equilibrium where more than a month ago, Trump apparently, or well, at least according to White House sources, gave Maduro an ultimatum to leave by Friday. That was like 3 Fridays ago. The problem is that this story is not new. He did exactly the same thing. Secretary Pompeo declared that Maduro's days were counted. He said this 4,500 days ago. So there's a moment at which these threats just don't do anything, because quite frankly, if what you're telling Maduro is, look, I have warships off of your coast, give up power, you have, but at the same time, you're telling him, we have $100 million bounty on your head, and you're a criminal and you're going to go to jail, then Maduro's going to do, I mean, he's just going to stay put. It's what makes most sense for him. So even if the U.S. bombs Venezuela, that's not going to change the political landscape in Venezuela. What could change it is if instead of saying Maduro has to leave, turn the negotiation around and say, let's get Maduro to release all political prisoners. I mean, Lukashenko just did it out of a negotiation with the U.S. So you could have freedom for all political prisoners, you get reestablishment of powers of the press, and you could have the creation of Venezuelan institutions which begin to be independent or to have some semblance of independence. What we have to do is try to get this country to an election in which there are enough guarantees so that if Chavismo loses the election, then they can hand over power to the opposition without feeling this, without seeing it as an existential threat. But if you tell anybody, any political leader, if you hand over power, you're going to jail, that political leader is going to say no. And if that political leader controls the military, you have to be smart about this. And I understand that many Venezuelans want to see the warships come in and want to see them get rid of Maduro. Reality check. I mean, that's not going to happen. The U.S. needs to mobilize 200,000 troops to invade Venezuela. There's 15,000 combat troops stationed in the Caribbean right now. Nobody in the U.S. political world is favoring a land invasion of Venezuela. So the best that we can get out of this is a negotiated solution. Let's use that pressure to get a negotiated solution.
Thank you. That was a fascinating tour of both the past and where we could ideally go. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.